Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be here and to welcome you today to the inaugural session of the McMaster Dialogues. This is a series of roundtable discussions, and it's an important forum to bring staff, faculty, and students together to talk about what universities do best. And that's to create space for our community to exchange ideas, share diverse viewpoints, and engaged in informed debate, which can shed new light on some of the most pressing global issues. As an institution committed to fostering innovation, collaboration, and impact, McMaster is uniquely positioned to contribute to this dialogue. By bringing together thought leaders from across the disciplines, we're seeking to create an environment where impactful ideas can flourish and collective solutions can emerge. We hope that you will have plenty of time for questions and that you'll engage in the conversation following our panelists. And so now I would like to, first of all, thank our Vice-Provost International, Bonny Ibhawoh, for moderating this important discussion and for his leadership in championing the McMaster Dialogues on global challenges. And I also want to thank the panelists for taking the time here today to share their insights and expertise. And so now I would like to introduce Bonny Ibhawoh to bring today's discussion forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. And thank you, colleagues, students, members of the McMaster community. Welcome to the inaugural session of the McMaster Dialogues. Like David said, this is an opportunity for us to have conversations about some of the global challenges that confront our world. We're joined today by three very distinguished members of the McMaster community and thought leaders. But before I introduce them, I just wanted to set the tone for the conversation today. So the first in this series of the McMaster Global Dialogues focuses on peace and security. The Global Peace Index, which is a measure of the peacefulness of the world, and this is an index released annually, states that there are 56 active conflicts happening around the world as we speak. 93 countries are involved in conflict outside their own borders. The Global Peace Index report also states that this is the highest number of countries involved in conflict since the end of the Second World War. So what is evident is that our world has become even more conflicted. And this is a challenge, not just for local communities where these conflicts are occurring, but also for our global community. So one of our tasks here today is to think through how we can all play a role, how we can foster multilateralism, and that is the cooperation and collaboration between individuals, societies, institutions, and countries to create a just, safer, and more sustainable world for all of us. So I'm glad to be joined today by three very distinguished colleagues. I'll introduce them. Dr. Alicia Schwartz is the Arnold Johnson Chair in Healthcare Ethics at the Center for Health Economics and Policy Analysis here at McMaster University. She's a professor of health research methods, and she will bring to our discussion today a wealth of experience on ethical policy frameworks on healthcare, particularly around the ethical dimension of global healthcare and the intersection with peace and security. Rick Monture is my colleague in the Faculty of Humanities. Dr. Rick Monture is a professor of English and Cultural Studies and provides a critical perspective on the intersection of indigenous knowledge systems and global peace building. His research is on indigenous rights and cultural resilience, which will offer valuable insights into how indigenous knowledge can contribute to our quest for local peace in communities and global peace. And finally, Dr. Don Abelson is the Academic Director of the Wilson College of Leadership and Civic Engagement, and he brings expertise of political science and international relations. His focus will be to help us understand how global politics can be managed in a way that fosters cooperation, multilateralism, all in a quest to achieve peace among nations. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. So I want to start with a general question before we delve into the specifics. So like I just said, the world is getting more conflicted. And it is clear that it can't continue like this. It is not sustainable. We can't continue to have these conflicts unhindered. We know firsthand the impact of this conflict on local communities. And we find increasingly that the impact is not just on local communities, but also on people living in countries that are not affected by conflicts because the traumas travel. And we see how conflicts happening in far-flung corners of the world reverberate even on our campuses. So my general question will be, what do we do about this? How does the world address these conflicts that seem to be endemic in our world? And I'll just throw that open to give you guys an opportunity to kind of say some opening statements on what you think of this topic. Maybe we'll start with you, Lisa.
Thank you. I mean, that's the big question, isn't it? And it's hard to know the answer to it. My first thought about it here at the university and probably here in Canada is that we're lucky enough, maybe that makes us privileged in ways that we shouldn't be, but we are lucky enough to have lived in relative peace for a period of time. Not good for everyone, but it's been moderately peaceful. And I feel like we have to be careful not to try to reproduce the violence that we're seeing overseas. We don't need to bring it here. I know that we feel it personally and we'll feel it in various different ways. But to mirror it is not going to bring us further or closer to a safer world. And I know that, working with groups who are involved in humanitarian action, one of the feelings of guilt that international actors bring with them is the sense that they can leave at any time. They've said to me, for me, I can just get on a plane and I can be having a coffee at the cafe down the road and it's over for me. And then they rethink it and think, but that's what everybody wants. Everybody wants that kind of security. So my first thought is that we have a responsibility, and it's probably one of the hardest things that we need to be committed to right now, not to reenact the violence, not to import the violence, and then to find ways to engage in mutual understanding and mutual respect with one another. I think it's been very hard to know what to do and what to say. I know for myself, the only words that I feel I can say clearly and with commitment is we want to end the violence. Everything else becomes overly complicated. So maybe sometimes staying with the silence and giving ourselves the opportunity to see reflected in one another the same kind of suffering, even if the parameters of that suffering look different. And to respect that in one another so that then we can move forward little step by little step, because I think that's where we're at right now.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Rick, it's obvious that the way we've been doing business is not working. The international rule-based order just hasn't addressed these questions of peace building and conflict resolution. And there's been talk that we need to find other ways. And I'm wondering what your insights will be on how Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous perspectives, long-standing traditions, might be solutions to these problems that confront our world.
Sure. A couple things I want to start with is the word for peace in our language, Mohawk, is skana. And it's actually a verb. So it doesn't denote a passive state of peacefulness and contentment even, but it's something we know about, but we're always having to work towards. And we understand a world that's going to always be in conflict. And that's fine. That's how things get, produced and recreated and torn down and recreated again. It brings life. It's what we do after conflict is the important thing. That's a big part of it. And that's a basic understanding we have in our traditions. And I want to emphasize too that probably every Indigenous cultural tradition and history that I know about has a similar thing, but I'll be coming at it from a Haudenosaunee perspective, Six Nations or Iroquois, and this is our traditional territory in the northeastern, North America here. So these stories that I will share this afternoon come from our tradition. I can't speak for other Indigenous nations that have similar things, very similar things, but I'll speak from our perspective. And so we have this concept also that's part of that long-standing tradition, 1,000 years old or more, I'm sure it's more, talks about this a dish with one spoon concept that we see in the land acknowledgement that McMaster has utilized. And what that is not, people sort of see it as a sharing of resources. Well, it is kind of, but it's mostly an idea that was given to our leadership a long, long time ago. And the concept was in a much different time when food security was not a given. Whenever any of our ancestors ate, it was always a blessing. It was, we had a great good fortune. The hunt was good. The seasons were good for growing because we're agricultural people too. But you couldn't just walk down to the supermarket or Tim Hortons and have access to food. We had to work for it. And everybody did. All of our ancestors worldwide had to work. So it comes from that idea of working hard. And once you're at the table, this one dish, it said that our leadership will be eating from one dish. It's metaphoric. And to have good table manners, to conduct themselves well. When we go to a fancy dinner, we're on our best behavior, right? There's the knives and forks go in a certain way, and there's a kind of, a rhythm to that niceness. It's an idea like that, where we don't overextend ourselves. We're not impolite. We don't, get in anybody's way. It's just just to conduct yourself well, peacefully, respectfully. Don't cause harm. And it said that the people will follow that. If they see their leaders acting a certain way, conducting themselves politely, respectfully, conversant, communicative, just being pleasant, let's say, in spite of everything, then the people will follow. And that's what you seem to see in the world today is leadership that is inflammatory and critical and shouting at one another. And the people kind of follow, right? So in our traditions, it's the leaders that are supposed to be conducting themselves in that way as if they're good table manners, let's say. So, that's an alternative way of looking at things, but it's not the only way. And as I was saying, our program began with this idea that we had something to share with people from around the world. The universities bring all these people and intellectual traditions together. This is our way that can help sort of further that discussion to sort of think about things just a little bit differently. And now we're facing a crisis, as you say, that we have not seen since the Second World War. And I'll share one more thing really quickly. Our traditions have been utilized in the past. The League of Nations that was begun after the close of the First World War was based on the Iroquois Confederacy, the Great Law of Peace, this coming together of nations. So it's called the League of Nations. And the Americans took some of their democratic ideas from us in the 1770s to create this democracy that was based around peace and unity. The 13 colonies as opposed to, paying taxes to England. So our traditions have been utilized to bring about peace and change and democracy. It's just not as talked about as much. So that was when we began, was to foreground those discussions yet again. So again, not the silver bullet to, maybe that's the wrong metaphor to use, but not the answer to our all of our worldwide problems, but understanding that we had a voice to add to that dinner table conversation and hopefully bring about peace that we're all facing together.
Thank you very much, Rick. Don, you're an expert in foreign policy, and one of the topics that comes up again and again is multilateralism. How do states work together? But when I think about multilateralism, I think beyond states. I also think about societies working together, institutions working together. What do you think? Where do you think multilateralism is going? And secondly, how do you think we can reinvigorate that initial spirit of multilateralism that kind of influenced the formation of the League of Nations, like Rick mentioned, the United Nations, and all the multilateral institutions that have helped the global world order going for a while now, but which now seem to be fraying at the edges. What do we do to recover those values?
Right. Well, it's a great question. It's an important question, and it's a question that we all have to think about. When I reflect on multilateralism, when I reflect on multilateral institutions and initiatives, I'm often reminded of the observation that the late Charles de Gaulle, President of France, made, that any state worthy of its name has no friends, only interests. And it's a very realist approach to the study of international relations. But why do I raise this? Because the success of multilateral institutions in large part depends on the willingness of different organizations and individuals to come together who can appreciate that the benefits of membership far outweigh the costs. So Rick talked about the League of Nations, an organization that the United States unfortunately never joined, despite the fact that the main catalyst for the formation of the League of Nations was President Woodrow Wilson. US wouldn't join. We can talk about the history of the United Nations and all the problems that have plagued that organization, despite the fact that over the past 70 odd years, we haven't had a global war. We've had many conflicts, but nothing that would mirror what happened in the Second World War. It's very important that we have discussions like this because the key is to convince states and other organizations, non-state actors, that it is in their interest to cooperate. And how do you do that? You have an engaged civil society. You have organizations, you have individuals, you have non-governmental organizations who take up the challenge about talking about the environment and sustainability, the importance of peace and security, what is at stake. And in a university setting, and I think we're going to probably get to this a little later, so I'm not going to go on too long about it, but one of the things that we often talk about, but I think we fall short, is breaking down our own silos and having the kind of conversations that we're doing this afternoon. This is the first time I've had a chance to meet Rick, first time I've had a chance to meet Lisa. Why is it that when we're housed in our own discipline, there is a reluctance to reach out? And that's one of the reasons why the Wilson College of Leadership and Civic Engagement was formed, to help break down those silos and give our future leaders an opportunity to speak with people in social sciences, the humanities, and in other faculties so they can learn best practices. There are challenges to multilateral institutions. Rick mentioned the level of political toxicity, the poison that we hear every night. I heard it last night when I got home from McMaster and putting on the TV only to listen to a former US president call Kamala Harris mentally impaired. This is the level of political discourse that is framing some of the most important debates that we will experience. It's about civil society, it's about aligning state interests with multilateral interests. But to get back to Rick's point, it's about leadership and it's about engagement. None of us, regardless of the position that we occupy, can afford to remain silent and on the sidelines. Those days are over. We need to engage in order to improve on the conditions that we see around us.
Well, thank you very much, Don. And I think you touched on what will be my next question here. What is the role of the university? What is our role? You'd mentioned, Lisa, that we should endeavor not to bring the conflict home. Sometimes that is inevitable. Our students come from those regions of the world where these conflicts are playing out. So in some ways, it's already here, So my question to you is twofold. You work on ethics and humanitarianism. How do we manage that when these conflicts reverberate on our campus? And what does the university do? What is the role of the university as a public institution, particularly in global conflicts that, frankly, universities don't have much leverage over but yet have to deal with because of the impact on members of the community.
Yeah, and it's probably not easy. I mean, I should say that I didn't mean to suggest that people shouldn't be feeling, a sense of attachment to places that they're from and the experiences that are happening there. When I said don't bring the violence, I didn't mean don't bring the discussion, the conflict. So I think that both of you have talked about civic engagement and the importance of learning how to have the conversation in a way that is respectful, which I think ethics brings us, at least starts us off with the sense that we are humans, that we are persons first, and everything else is added. So recognizing first the human spark in the person with us. More importantly, avoiding entrenching the differences. And making sure that we have created the space to respectfully listen to one another, which is something that I felt we were beginning or have begun to kind of let go of, partly because it's modeled for us in ways that just don't make sense on the world stage. But what we can do at universities is open up the possibility for discussions. So using the moral imagination, thinking about oneself in a different place, a different time, maybe even using your moral imagination to think about being the other. And what is it that's making other perspectives or other reasoning, I guess, reasonable to the person who's experiencing it? I guess the hope is that within a framework of discussion, we can be open to listening and taking seriously without othering. And that means taking that moment of respecting and expecting the best from others. I heard Martha Nussbaum speaking recently. She said, approaching people with goodwill and hope. And I feel that universities are a place where we can approach one another in that way and take seriously, again, the reasonings and the rationales for the justifications that they're making for their actions, but then also pushing those boundaries respectfully, cautiously, in a way that recognizes that multilateralism means that we have multiple perspectives and that each of those perspectives needs some space to be addressed, to be heard. Just because it gets the space to be heard doesn't necessarily mean it's right. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it will be constructive. So I think ethics should give us some framing. I think we're going to ask about frameworks and ethical frameworks. So I'll jump the gun if that's okay.
That's fine.
Framing that provides a certain amount of responsibility or accountability to the other. So I think that's what ethics can do, that goes beyond just sort of turning in on oneself, establishing processes that allows us to respectfully hear from one another, setting up our understanding of mutual accountability, the reciprocity that has to go into the decisions that we're making, so that if we are hoping for respect and dignity for our needs, for our human rights, that calls to bear the responsibilities to provide that and to respect that for others as well. And I think that there's scope. I was looking back at the UN Charter for this, or the original UN Charter, which, as you said, was created after the First and Second World Wars. Within the Charter, the aspiration is for us all to be safe and live securely together in the same spaces. And they specify things like multilateralism to allow the discussion to happen in such a way that again, the voices from various different places, particularly the silenced and the marginalized voices, will be permitted to have some space to be heard.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Lisa. That's helpful. Rick, some have suggested that the universities should not be involved in these issues. In fact, some institutions have said, we will not be involved, we will not comment on global conflicts, we will only contain ourselves with matters relating to the four walls of our campus and our institution, a kind of disengagement from the public space. I wonder what you think the role of the universities should be, given how fractured and fraught many of these conflicts are.
Yeah, I think, think the university certainly changed from when I came here in the 1980s. It was a different kind of world then, peaceful for the most part, right? I was a student here in 1991, the first Gulf War, and all of that green area on the quad in front of, I've been here forever, I can't remember all the names of the building, where the flagpoles are, the big flagpoles, was full of, as a peace camp, full of tents, just full of tents. And the university allowed this camp to go on for a few weeks in February, March. And that was good. Dialogue was happening, all that kind of thing. I was in graduate school on September 11th when that happened, 9/11. And it was amazing to me that at grad school in English, this is in English, there was no discussion about what had happened. It was almost like nothing had happened. And that kind of shocked and surprised and saddened me a little bit. It's like, we're at a university, we're supposed to take up these big issues. We're in graduate school, we're big kids now, you know? But everyone was very timid and afraid to do that. So within 10 years, it seemed like there was the culture of the university had shifted a little bit and kind of staying away from these things. And I understand, probably, maybe it's not in the university's best interest to do that. We're not here for that kind of thing. But I think in some ways we are. Many ways we are. We have to take on these big issues. We need all the people all the time doing all the things. And like Don said, here we are talking about a similar topic that's very close to us, and we've never really actually had a chance to meet in dialogues. It's good. But I think the biggest thing that the universities can have to offer is students. Yeah. There's a youthful optimism, there's an energy, a dynamism that happens, that doesn't happen for us as being older and more tired, jaded a little bit, or whatever it may be. There's a sense of excitement and wonder and curiosity and determination that students have and can bring to this conversation. And we have to model that as leaders at the university for those students. One thing I'm caught up in, I think all of us are as professors here, is how do we, give the students, and Lisa mentioned this, goodwill and hope. How do we maintain hope in our students when things seem pretty bleak right now? Let's be honest. Climate change, there's fires, there's global conflicts. How do we do that? How do we find that balance of being truthful, of being honest, but also giving our students a sense of hope, and each other, as faculty members, staff, everybody here. We're a community here. This is a place that we all share together. And that's the difficult part, but that's the necessary part. And so that's what I'm always thinking about when whether it be talking about residential schools. I've been talking about residential schools here at the university for 20-something years, before it was a holiday of some sort. So I know it is tough going, right? It's tough talking about these truths. My family's been impacted by these things. Teaching about those things while I'm being, reminded all the time of how my own family was involved with or impacted by these things. So I think it's important that we were able to do that. Last fall, a year ago now, I was teaching a course, Indigenous Perspectives on Peace and Conflict. How timely was that? And it was tough, but I remember the time I was a graduate student and 9/11 happened and there was no discussion. I knew I had to talk about what had just happened. And we did. We had a tough conversation, but the students rose to the occasion. They monitored themselves, and there was some, passion and fear and anger and hurt, but they policed themselves, if you will. Maybe that's the wrong word, but we had a good conversation. We did that for that class, first class back after October 7th and the one after. And students came up to me after and thanked me. They said, Dr. Monture, Thank you for that opportunity. In my other classes, we didn't have those conversations. So it was a relief. It could have gone any number of ways, but luckily enough, because I think that's just it. We want to talk about that. We have to talk about these things. They're important to us. And I think that's the role of the university. Maybe that's a convoluted way to get to where you wanted me to go, Bonnie, but I have great faith in this place. It's changed in many ways, economic necessity and things, but it still has the students. They still have youth here. We still have our future policymakers and leaders, and there's an enthusiasm that they bring to us, right? That we may be tired some days, but we see their smiles and their questions, and we're emboldened by that. That's why I'm here, for the
Thank you very much. Thank you. And Don, you talked about the role of leadership, toning down the rhetoric.
Yes.
Having leaders being the adults in the room once again.
That would be nice.
and I think this is exactly what the Wilson Institute is all about, university as a space for cultivating civic leadership. Could you speak a bit more about how you see that evolving, how that panning out, how the university can actually become the incubator for cultivating a new breed of leaders, so to speak, because it's leadership that is often at the forefront of many of these issues.
Absolutely, and this is something that we've been talking about now for several months as we try to define leadership and the kinds of students that we want to train and nurture and see grow in this environment. And when Wilson College was formed, the mandate was really not only to reach out to people who've been told their entire lives that they possess strong leadership qualities and they're destined to go into a boardroom or they're destined to head up a hospital or some other organization. It was to reach out to people who, when they look in a mirror, they don't see themselves as leaders. But if they are immersed in the right environment, one that is supportive, one that is nurturing, one that instills the confidence in them, so then they can then instill the confidence in others. That's what Wilson College is all about. It's about getting students to think about how they can make a difference, how they can impact the lives of the people around them in their community, in the province or territories, the national and international level. Last fall, Wilson College was involved in a very important project called Canada 2080. And Mr. Wilson, Red Wilson, your former chancellor, had supported a number of research projects. And I was moderating a discussion. I wasn't feeling great that day. I had come down with a terrible cold, as I normally do in the fall. And I was moderating a discussion with 5 or 6 researchers. And one of our colleagues from one of the science departments, at the end, I asked them, what was the most important thing you learned from your research? And I'll never forget this as long as I live. And she said, after doing the kind of work that she was doing, it was very sensitive and deeply moving. She said, I think I've learned to become more comfortable dealing with issues that are inherently uncomfortable. And that just stuck with me because I thought, you know what, in a few words, you have really captured the essence of what we ought to be doing at universities. And that is to create a space for students to test out ideas, to exchange ideas, to have difficult conversations. And I know there's an aversion to having difficult conversations. We try to avoid it in our personal lives. We try to avoid it professionally. But the reality is, until we have those difficult conversations, we can't move forward. And they're not always pleasant. They could be very, very taxing. They could be emotionally draining, but they are necessary. That is how we learn. So when I follow, as I have for now over 40 years, American elections very closely, and I see the level of anger and animosity and vitriol, that's not leadership. Leadership isn't about the person who can scream the loudest. It's about the person who can listen in an effective manner and bring people together. And one of the things that I've said from the very beginning, and I've only been here since last October, is what I've always admired about McMaster is that progressive edge, that desire to make a difference. And as a former colleague of mine at Western used to say, to move the yardsticks. And he would always say to me at the end of the day, Don, I know it's been tough, but do you think you've moved the yardsticks? And I think if we ask ourselves those questions, have we made a difference? Have we made it a little easier for someone to raise difficult issues? We all come from different backgrounds and different lived experiences. I haven't lived your life, you haven't lived mine, but we could both benefit by having a respectful and important exchange. But the kind of rhetoric that we see on a daily basis, people running for the highest office, not only in the United States, but in the globe. And the best thing they can do is exchange insults. Where have we gone wrong? So the students that we want to train and educate are those that have both passion and compassion, those who are not seeking popularity, but seeking to change and improve the lives of others. And for those of you who might know, for the 5 years before I arrived at McMaster, I worked with former Prime Minister Mulroney, setting up his institute out east. And over one of the many conversations we had over the course of 5 years, and there were many, he would say to me, don't become a leader to become popular. It never works. You do it to make a difference. Yeah. And that's what we are trying to do with Wilson College, with the support of this institution, is to change the dynamics and to make sure that our students not only have the capacity to listen, but have the ability both to look forward and behind them. Because as a famous British historian, A.J.P. Taylor, once remarked, the only lesson of history is that nothing is learned. Our graduates are going to do something very different.
Thank you so much, Don. Very well said. So we've had a very interesting conversation from a vast variety of perspective, ethics, indigenous knowledge, international relations, and foreign policy. I think there's an opportunity now to turn it over to the McMaster community. We're privileged today to have a diverse group of students, faculty, and staff. And the idea behind the McMaster Dialogue is to foster conversation. So I welcome your questions and comments on the deliberations, and any contributions is welcome. Yes, please.
Thank you. Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Ibhawoh Chikanda. I'm an associate professor in the School of Earth, Environment, and Society in the Faculty of Science. I just want to go back to the issue of indigenous knowledge systems and global peace. So I was just reminded of the way that we are seated right now in a circle. Where I come from, that's how people would sit in our communities, say, when we want to solve, say, community problems. We call that DARE, D-A-R-E. So that's how we would sit. And that circle would actually symbolize a lot of things. It shows that we are all equal, and it would also symbolize unity within the society. So there are so many ideas that we can glean, we can learn from indigenous knowledge systems or traditional knowledge systems on how we can solve or address global peace. So one thing that comes to mind is the truth and reconciliation system. So parts of it, it's actually borrowed from certain aspects of African culture. We have seen that being applied in post-conflict societies in South Africa, in Rwanda, and so forth. So I was just trying to look at the position of certain societies, Africa being a good example, that we have these rich ideas from societies such as Africa, but then Africa, it doesn't have a voice, a big voice at the global level. We look at multilateral institutions such as the United Nations, for example. We don't have that big representation. For example, we don't have any country that has veto power, just like the US and Russia has. So the big question for me now is, how can we ensure that those societies that have something to contribute to global peace can also be given a seat at the table so that they can also be part of the solution to these problems that we are facing?
Thank you very much. That's a very good one. And I think, Don, you're well positioned to take that one because it deals with the global governance architecture and the limitations of that architecture as it currently stands.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it has played out many times before. And one of the strategies that some countries in Africa have pursued, countries in Asia and other parts of the world, is that they find issues that they are in close alignment with one of the larger, more dominant powers. One of the things that Canada witnessed during the 1980s was, by virtue of the close relationship that the United States and Canada enjoyed at that time, with President Reagan, with President Bush, again, regardless of the political positions you take, what that ended up doing was representatives, leaders from around the world would reach out to our Prime Minister to say, it's going to be virtually impossible for me to get a meeting with a Ronald Reagan or a George H.W. Bush, but I know how well Canada is respected in those circles. Could you serve as an advocate? Could you help advance our agenda at an appropriate time in an appropriate forum? So I think there are opportunities. I would love to be able to say that it's a level playing field. It is not a level playing field. There are some states that are going to generate more exposure and more interest than others, but it does not preclude them from thinking strategically, politically, about aligning themselves with other countries with whom they share some commonalities and shared interests to serve as advocates. A lot of what we talked about this afternoon, and we could talk more about civil society and non-governmental organizations, it's about the capacity to advocate on behalf of a particular issue, an organization, a group of individuals. We don't do enough of that. We don't. We don't engage strategically as much as we should. We take for granted that things will just unfold. Oh, this is the way things have been for years, so we're happy with that. No. In order to affect change, you have to be, I'm not going to say aggressive, but you have to be savvy. And so I think, given the question that you've laid out, there is opportunity. It's about identifying the right pressure points and when in the conversation you want to have or hope to have the greatest impact. We have done it in Canada on many occasions because we have sought out other allies. So it's important to know in any particular policy area, whether you're speaking about the environment or you're talking about global peace and security, food security, whatever it might be, who are the leaders? How do you align yourself? How do you get yourself into the room and get a seat? Maybe it won't be in a circle, it might be at a table, but nonetheless, you need to make your presence felt.
Thank you very much. I don't know if Rick or Lisa have anything to add? Because Rick, I think this is not just a global issue, it's also national. How we've been talking here about Indigenous perspectives. How do we amplify them so that they are at the table, they're taken seriously, whether at national level or at global level? We recognize that there's value in Indigenous knowledge, and you've outlined that it has been used in the past, whether in the League of Nations or the building of the American nation. But these voices have to be at the table. So how do we uplift the voices of Indigenous communities, of the marginalized?
Yeah, it's happening slowly, but you're absolutely right. There was a time when we were, powerful people in our traditional territories, and the Dutch and the French and the Spanish and the British all came over sort of seeking our counsel and, treaty relationships with us. We won't get into all that because that's 500 plus years of discussion, but there was that time. And the founding fathers of America, Benjamin Franklin being one, had lots of discussions with our leadership at the time about this great law of peace. And like I said, that informed his kind of, the Declaration of We the People. Before that, didn't exist really in the American consciousness. But he stole those ideas from us. The American eagle is a symbol of America. That's an image that we employed, as well as those arrows in that eagle's talons. If you look at the presidential seal, there's 13 arrows. We had the individual who assembled our people under this League of Nations, early League of Nations, let's call it the first 5 nations. He addressed the people. He said, he took one arrow and he said, here's one nation, it's easily broken. And he took 5 arrows. He said, 5 nations, they will bend, but they won't break. So your greatest strength is in unity, collaboration, strength. It gives the people that. All sorts of metaphors that were in everyday use amongst our people. And actually assembled all of our individual nations at the time. We had certain cultural similarities and linguistic similarities, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca at that time in now New York State. So he was able to utilize those images and empower them. And the other big thing that he said is once all of our people were assembled, and as you may know, we lived in longhouses, a structure that housed many families, matrilineal families. And he said, from here forward, you people will all live as under one roof. And that's what Haudenosaunee means. We build the house of peace. It's continually being built. It's continually being worked upon. As we all live in homes, they all need constant renovation and upkeep. That's what we do as collectively as a people. Now, we have this process, and now I'm getting to your point, because nothing has a quick answer in these old traditions. And I'm doing it in English. It doesn't have the same kind of power. But when we add nations to this collective, we have the ability to do that. We call it adding rafters to that longhouse. So if you think about a longhouse had a rafter, they were big, long, rectangular structures. Early folks in North America said they housed anywhere from between 50 to 500 people. They're huge structures. Anyway, when you expand upon that unity, we add a rafter. So building upon the thing we knew in each and every day, but also metaphorically. So that gives the house of peace strength, adding nations. Big or small, they can be added under the umbrella of this great law of peace, this big tradition of peace. So again, these things were shared. We didn't expect or think that we had global solutions, but again, it's contributing to the overall well-being of mankind. It was always been said that that great law of peace tradition could be expanded upon. There was always room for expansiveness. It was always inclusive, not exclusive. So it's always that unending opportunity, I guess. So a lot there, but yeah.
Thank you. Lisa, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, that was beautiful. But it did make me wonder if we've been too exclusive even in the writing of the documents and the statements. So yes, this happened in San Francisco with mainly European, I think probably there were others around the table, but the language is English. I'm curious to know what would happen if we took these statements and translated them into rarer languages. And if there would be concepts that would emerge that we could then incorporate that do a better job. For a long time, we've talked about solidarity, and I was really committed to that notion of solidarity. And then I was in Rwanda, and I saw Ubuntu on the wall in the Genocide Memorial Center. And it struck me that Ubuntu does a better job than solidarity does. Solidarity is always in opposition to something else. I'm in solidarity with, but I'm also in solidarity against. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't work in a world where we're trying to assemble some understanding. Ubuntu is about mutual interconnection. Mm-hmm. As I understand it, and maybe you guys could clarify more, but I think it's a theory that allows us to be more invitational, to open up to the extra rafters, and that doesn't have to always be in opposition to something else. So I would like to see us rethinking the values and the principles that we're using to guide these kinds of decision making right now, and to think about a different way of measuring power. So right now, the minority voices at the UN are there, I suspect, have the most power because of money. And it's really funny. I don't know why we give moral authority to money. We have so many counterexamples as to why somebody with money might not be the right person to be a moral authority on anything. Why don't we do it differently? We're thinking about refugees, and what is it? Right now, there are 117 million people displaced, forcibly displaced from their homes, and 73% of the lower middle of those populations are staying in low and middle income countries. What if we gave more power, veto power, to the people who are the most hospitable to refugees? What if we said, if you want to have a veto place on the UN Security Council, you have to host so many people. I mean, I think we do to a certain extent, but we're not doing it in the same way. So what if we replaced Bangladesh with the United States, at least temporarily?
It's quite ambitious.
It's ambitious. I know, I was thinking this is utopian, but maybe that's not such a bad idea. I think we have to rethink.
Yes,
That's what I'm
yes.
suggesting.
Yes.
I was just going to add to what Lisa said, because when you go back to the UN Charter in 1945, by virtue of giving the 5 so-called great powers the veto, the UN from the very beginning created 2 separate worlds, right? Because so long as the 5 permanent members, the United States, China, Great Britain, oh my God, I'm forgetting France, and Russia, thank you, had the veto power, so long as they had it, very little could be achieved, certainly in terms of peace and security. And I remember years ago when I was doing my master's thesis, and it was on the politics of UN reform. And I wrote to senior delegates in all of those countries, the great powers, whether it was Russia, the United States, whatever it was, and proposed the idea of altering the distribution of the veto. And everyone wrote back and said the same thing: no veto, we're not here, we're out. The veto was what allowed the 5 powers to come together. The absence of a veto would send them packing.
There you go.
But in many ways, whether it's the United States or Russia or some of the other countries, they have used the veto in order to hold the rest of the institution hostage, because it has paralyzed the UN's efforts to do the things that would, in all likelihood, promote greater peace.
But I think this is why conversations like these are necessary, because one of the inspiration for the McMaster Dialogue is the Pact for the Future. Just last week, 143 world leaders gathered in New York for the Summit of the Future, and they signed on a Pact for the Future. And one of the questions that was being addressed is, has the old architecture outlived its usefulness?
Right.
Do we need to restructure the United Nations? And there was also a sense that the conversations have now to be forward-looking. We're no longer in the immediate post-war era, and the international governance architecture that might have worked for that era might not be fit for purpose for now and the future. So there is that conversation happening, and this is why I think dialogues like this are crucial to thinking through how we address this in the future. I think we have time for a few more questions. Yes, we'll take you.
Hello, my name is Batul. I am a 4th-year undergraduate student in the Faculty of Science. And you mentioned a really interesting term, moral imagination, that I had never heard before. And I found it really interesting. I feel like it could be something to battle desensitization from hearing about a lot of conflicts that are ongoing. And I'm wondering, as a leader, how can we evoke moral imagination in others?
Oh, wow, really good question. I guess the beauty of moral imagination is it allows you to think about how the outcomes might turn out, how other people are going to respond, and what the possibilities are. So apart from the fact that it's a lot of fun to be able to create and use your imagination in those ways, it invites us to step outside of what the norms are, and to use a way of rethinking in order to reorder our values and our priorities and what's expected. It would be lovely if we could go to the leaders and say, use your moral imagination on this. But I guess in the absence of that, inviting people to embrace, I think we've been saying it over and over again, embrace the perspective of the other. And then using resources like literature, like film, like even music, dance, to invoke and enliven the way we think about an experience, I think probably would go a long way. But not if it just stops at the sense of, oh, look at me, I cried at that, it touched me so much. But actually to be able to call people on, now that you've seen this, now that you've learned this, what kinds of changes do you think you could make? So that's probably the role of university students, and reminding us that we need to take those lessons and put them into action.
We'll take a couple more questions. Yes, we'll take one from Stefan. You need a mic.
I'm in the philosophy department here at McMaster. So I had a question. I was this has been a rich and wide-ranging dialogue or conversation about international conflict and how we respond to that. And what particularly struck me was this set of issues relating around the university's role, the proper role of the university in responding to the prevalence and maybe even the increase of international conflict. And I was thinking, I was imagining two different ways that the university might envision its role in responding. And I just wanted to set out those two ways without advocating for either and see what you folks thought about, invite a conversation about that. One thought would be, well, the university's role is to maintain something like institutional neutrality on all these conflicts so as to house a free-flowing discussion about them, their causes, their nature, and all this kind of thing. And so that's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it would be, well, actually, no, there are some issues that the university as an official body needs to take a stand on. And in service of, alleviating our international conflict or prevalence of conflict. I'm curious how you might respond to those two, or your thoughts about those two different modalities of envisioning the university, conception of the university's response to international conflict.
Panel, isolationism or interventionism?
I'm not sure. Yeah. Isolationist, because it seems to me that there are two different ways of engaging.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
Okay. I'll back you up.
Oh, all right. Well, I often need that. My position on this, and I think I've made it fairly clear over the last several months, and I think the university administration has supported this. I think our responsibility as a university community to provide a safe space for people to engage, to talk about the issues despite how difficult they are, to be able to have conversations. We can't be afraid to disagree. That's inevitable. It's going to happen. But I think there should be zero tolerance at the university for people who have felt harassed, intimidated, threatened, demeaned, demoralized. I think the university absolutely has a responsibility. And I think the university has done a fairly good job in terms of conveying that message. We're all here to learn. We're all here to exchange ideas and to benefit from that. But no one, whether you're a student, faculty member, staff, should come to McMaster on any day and feel less than anyone else. And I, as the privileged head of Wilson College, I have zero tolerance for that. And as I often tell my own students in political science, your politics is your politics. Don't worry about me judging you. So long as you can present a compelling argument, that's your role. My role is not to judge. My role is to listen and to evaluate the strength of your argument. I have some concerns about institutions, publicly funded institutions, taking an official position. I agree with you up to a point, and I've said this many times over the last couple of months. One of the problems that our leaders often run into is that they see the world in terms of left and right instead of right and wrong. And I think in order for us to kind of reset our moral compass, going along with Lisa's point about moral imagination, there are some things that are just fundamentally wrong, and we need to have the courage and conviction to say so. And one of the things that I hope comes out of these dialogues, again, getting back to the point I made before, about having difficult conversations. They're not always pleasant. It takes courage and conviction, because you know what you're doing by having a difficult conversation? You're making yourself vulnerable. Leaders don't like to be vulnerable, and they like things that are predictable. Well, I hate to break it to you, life is anything but predictable. So I love your question, because it could really serve as the basis for an even longer and more fruitful exchange. And, you know, I often say, you know, as a political scientist, and my students often shake their heads, and I think I said this to the class that one of my students is in, Emily and Sarah, that I've been a political scientist for 33 years. I hate politics. I do. But I love process. I love how ideas come together. And I wish we had more time, because your question really gets to the heart of so many things about the role of universities, what we do as scholars, what our students need to learn so that they can formulate their own thoughts. It's not about adhering to ours, it's their minds that they need to develop. So I love the question, because it's taxing and it's not easy. But those are exactly the kind of conversations we need to have. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar, as you pointed out, Don, and I touched on briefly, is that we have to be able to have those honest conversations, as difficult as they may be. And getting back to my earlier point about the dish with one spoon and good table manners, it's what it comes down to. It's just respectful dialogue, open communication, honesty, all that kind of stuff. And it may seem like a quaint metaphor stuck in antiquated time, but it has usefulness in 2024 and beyond. That's what allows these oral traditions to expand and be meaningful today and not way back when. Another interesting point, and I'll touch on this quickly because we talked about this a little bit, but leadership. And amongst our people, the Haudenosaunee people, we're a matrilineal society, and it's our women who pick the leaders. So the way it is, we have 9 clans across all of our nations, 3 from the water, 3 from the land, 3 from the air. And the oldest woman of each of those clan within nations is known as the clan mother, and she picks the leaders, the up and coming leaders. And the reason that's done is because she sees a young man growing up. From the time he's crawling on the floor, he's a young boy, he reaches adulthood, he starts a family, she's watching him in her clan family. That's the kind of leader I want, the one who's not, bully or braggart, the one who's generous and kind and listen and can speak and have conversations. She watches that, she's monitoring that. And he is the leader that she will pick. And she has ultimate power. She can take away his authority like that as well. So again, it goes back to, she would, for instance, back in the day, 1491 and before, and even since then, because our traditional Confederacy Council is still in operation today, monitors for that kind of individual who can have those conversations and allow dialogue and listen. It's very important to listen. I could go on, there's a lot more in that, but the idea that it's a woman who picks the leadership, because they see the guy who has longevity. And it's also a title that you hold from the time you are stood up, we call it, whether it's usually somewhere in your 40s or your 50s, right until you die. And the other interesting thing is that you take the name of your predecessor. So it's the same consistent 50 leaders that we've had in our nation since time immemorial continues to this day. So you inherit not only that person's name, there's this through line from the very beginnings of our leadership to now. You're responsible, you sit in that fellow's chair, let's say. You are honoring his legacy and your own, and you add to that, and you're accountable throughout your life, not just a 3-year term or a 5-year term, but throughout your life. So lots of things in there, but yeah, in terms of, back to the university, yeah, having that dialogue and collaboratively figure out what kind of institution we want to be, you know.
So we'll take one last question. Jay, so your hand's up. Yes, you're in front. Yes.
Hello, I'm Basali Manimoran. I'm a McMaster Science Society president and a life science student. But one thing that I always advocate for is leadership and how we've been talking about that. And I'm really happy to be here today because it really emphasizes that students can be leaders and everyone in this room can be leaders. And I love the point that you made before where it's like, it's not just one person that can never be a leader. Everyone has the chance to do so. And I'm trying to advocate for that. I know a lot of students here today are also trying to advocate for that and that understanding that anyone can be a leader. It's not just because you're born like that. There's many ways that we as the university or we as students or we as faculty members or community members that can help uplift other students or other people to become leaders. It doesn't even have to be at the student level. It can be our peers or colleagues, even as adults. And past that and beyond that. So I would like to know your thoughts about how we can increase that and increase that engagement and increase that inspiration within other students and other faculty members. It does not have to be just at the undergraduate level. There's more than that. And I think inspiring other people to just grow and inspire others to like have these conversations and have topics like these discussed throughout is very important. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Well, I first of all, thank you for your comments and for your support. Yeah, we're humans. We observe what takes place around us. We admire certain qualities in people. And I think leading by example, so what you're doing, you know, the best way I think to feel inspired is to see what other people have achieved and the sacrifices that they have made. And just to show, you know, how many different ways there are to have an impact. I know university presidents and other administrators think about this all the time. How do we measure our success? How do we measure our performance? How do we measure the societal impact that we're having? And my position is, it's going to take time. You know, it takes time to nurture that kind of person. But we know throughout history that, you know, individuals have had a profound impact on shaping the political, social, economic, and cultural life of nations and indeed of the world. So for me, it all begins with finding that inner confidence. And I remember I was a young PhD student and I was doing some field work at Berkeley and Stanford. This was in the mid-1980s. And I was working out of a data research center in downtown Oakland. And I walked in and my research was on think tanks and public policy. And you talk about a community of scholars. When I was quite young and just starting to think about a proposal, I had a lot of nerve back then, and I wrote to about 2 or 3 dozen of the most prominent political scientists in the United States, policymakers, and I told about my topic, and I said, this is what I want to do, this is what I'm thinking of doing, I'm Canadian, and what do you think? And within about 3 weeks, again, pre-cell phone and email, I had about a 90% response, and I always kept those letters. But the reason I'm telling you this is, when I walked into that data center, saw what was available, my eyes lit up like a kid in a candy store, and I had a real moment. And I remember going back to the Berkeley campus, and back then you still had phone booths, and I got in and I called my parents, and I was on top of the world. And I thought, oh my God, I finally figured out what I'm going to do with my life. And I called them and I thanked them. And they said, well, what are you thanking us for? You're the one who scraped together the money to go. I said, it's not about the money. It's about giving me the confidence. That's what we need to do. Because if you've got the confidence and you believe in yourself, you're going to have others believe in you too. I feel very strongly about that because the people who have shaped me, my professors when I was an undergraduate, I think about them every day. I'm still in touch with them. I still can't call them by their first names. And people can have a huge impact on you. So I've often said in different talks to McMaster alumni groups, each one of us is looking for that moment that transforms who we are and what we're going to do, right? And I often quote, Mark Twain, the two most important days in your life are the day you're born and the day you discover why.
That's interesting.
All of us have to figure that out. And I think creating the environment, the kind of supports that are available, the kind of work that you're doing that will inspire other people, that's the greatest gift that we can give to other students and to each other. Because if we feel that way and we have the confidence to make a difference, we will make a difference. And it doesn't matter how small. The fact that you've changed somebody's life makes it all worth it.
Very well said. I'll just invite our panelists to make concluding thoughts. We started off with the question, how do we address the growing problem of conflict around the world? And how can we reinvigorate cooperation and multilateralism? So just briefly, concluding thoughts. Where do you think we should be going? What do you think we should be doing? Lisa, I'd like to start with you.
It's a good question, too. Concluding thoughts. I've been listening to the questions, and there's so much that's been said. I feel like part of it will be in the process. So I think, Don, you started to say how the importance of process and some of the things that Rick described as well. Who's at the table? And how do we make sure that the voices of, somebody once described the marginalized of the marginalized, can be at the table, those who are going to be most affected. So we need a process that's going to be fair and just, that will allow us to grapple with the hard problems, because some of them are not easily resolved. And I know that when a problem is that tough and is even intractable, knowing that we've used a fair process helps people to feel at least like they can accept and buy in. But that also means attending to the people who feel that they've lost in the process. Sometimes we think that like with democracy, majority rules, everybody should be happy, and there's just a few who are not so happy about it, but never mind about them. Actually, I think our role is to mind about them, to make sure that people don't feel disenfranchised by the process and feel that they can be members in the community in a real way, in a genuine sort of a way. And that means going back to those people and saying, here, you didn't win, but here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to keep you involved. I've also worried about outrage and what we do with outrage. And I feel that it's a great motivator in the way that, it'll make a person a leader. What it doesn't do very well is reconcile. And so in this time, in this world, yes, I appreciate it. I feel the outrage myself. But when we come to the table to do that multilateral work, maybe the outrage needs to be left at the door so that we can again begin to this kind of mutual acknowledgement, approaching people with goodwill and hope.
Thank you very much. Rick, concluding thoughts?
I have many. I'll try to distill them down. But I think a big part of it is confidence. That Donna mentioned, instilling that in students. I could go on about the moments in my life that sort of the things that changed my direction. And I was just lucky to have those folks around me. High school teacher, and one high school teacher that got me from being a high school student to the university. Once at the university, different teachers and professors here who, just something they said or a particular class or lecture kept me here. Okay. And they gave me confidence, whether they did it knowingly or unknowingly or subconsciously or unconsciously or very strategically, I'm not sure, but it worked. I know when I was a student here, I think I mentioned this, when the Oka crisis happened and traditional leadership from our community came to the university to talk to McMaster about having a space for Indigenous voices and intellectual traditions here, long before TRC, long before the university had to respond to such things, and McMaster answered that call. And when I saw my, friends and friends of my dad's here at the university, they'd never been to high school. They dropped their high school dropouts, but they were super smart and intellectual and confident in what we had to offer. And so those began those discussions. That gave me the confidence to stay here. There is a place for me at this university. The kid from Six Nations. There is a place for me here. And so I was giving a lecture as a CLA, my first or second class maybe I taught in the mid-90s, the Introduction to Indigenous Studies. And I gave a lecture one night, and I didn't know this until many years after. So Dr. Amy Monture, who some folks may know, she's a doctor at Six Nations. She tells a story that she was a young single mother. She had just lost her partner at a young age. She had 2 or 3 kids at home at the time. She didn't know what she was going to do with her life. She was in her mid-20s. She came she accompanied a friend of hers to lecture here one night, and I just happened to be lecturing in that class. And Amy's in the classroom, not knowing what to do with her life. She sees Rick down there delivering a lecture. Hey, Rick can do this, I can do this. It gave her the confidence to go back to university, get her medical degree, and wouldn't you know it, as my dad's in a palliative condition, she's helping him. So the way that these things go, you don't know at the time. It's just complete coincidence, but that's the power of education, the power of confidence building and leadership. You sort of do it organically. And I'll give you one more quick story. Maybe it has nothing to do with our discussion, but it is the power of education and what you as educators can do to be a leader. So, the first few months of the pandemic, and we're all huddled in our homes, about this time of the night, a knock comes at our door and it's raining out. Who's coming to our door? Who has the nerve to knock on our door in the middle of a global pandemic at supper time in a rainstorm? And I'm living with my dad at the time, who was, like I said, palliative. And there's an older woman, older Native woman at the door, and she said, "Does Carol Monture still live here?" And that's my mom. She's been gone since 1983, so she's been gone a long, long time. But she was a kindergarten teacher on the reserve. So this woman comes to the door, and I said, "No, she's passed on." She goes, "Oh, I'm so sorry." She said, "I just want to let you know that I was in a kindergarten class," and she said, "You can be anything you want to be." And that stuck with her all her life. She said, I carried that with me everywhere I went in my life, and I went to be a teacher in British Columbia, and I just wanted to come back and say thank you. All those years later.
Amazing.
And I think that is, to me, it made me feel good, but I've heard that from different people over time, because my mom was such a great kindergarten teacher, I guess, that she had that influence on people that instilled confidence from a young age, and that's what we can do as educators and our impact upon students. So.
Thank you so much, Rick. Thank you.
Welcome.
And Don?
Yeah, I would just say a few things. One, I think we all have a responsibility to try and combat apathy and indifference. We see what's happening in the world, see what's happening in the United States. No one can afford to remain silent. And getting back to the point about left versus right, right versus wrong, I've been writing a series of opinion pieces for the Hamilton Spectator over the last several months, and 2 months ago, I guess I struck a sensitive chord. It's the first time in my 33-year career that I ended up getting hate mail, so I figured I was on the right path. And our leaders need to understand, as Kenneth Waltz, a very prominent American political scientist, said once, that in a war there is no victory, only varying degrees of defeat. And I think that's a message that we have to share with people who are in positions of authority, who are putting people in harm's way, destroying lives in the process. And we can't afford to be complacent, because we're going to regret it. Yeah. And we have a chance to speak up. Technology affords us with an opportunity that we didn't have as children. Let's use it properly and constructively, and make our presence felt and our voices heard. And I think if we can do that in our own way, hopefully we'll make the difference that we're all looking for.
Thank you so much. In war, there is no victory, only varying degrees of defeat. Very profound, and thank you for sharing that.
I wish I could take credit for it, but it was somebody else.
Yeah, and this brings us to the end of this first of the series. I want to extend a special thanks to the panelists. They all said yes the first time when I asked, in spite of their busy schedules. Lisa, Rick, and Dawn, thank you very much for being thought leaders here at this institution and for sharing your expertise and your stories. I want to thank David, our president, for initiating these dialogues at this time. These are the kind of conversations we need to have. And all of you, students, staff, faculty who've joined us for what I think has been a very productive, fruitful, and insightful conversation. Thank you very much.